All right. Thank you guys for coming to my talk. My name is Max Planck. I am the technology director and one of the co-founders of Oculus Story Studio. I was involved in Henry and Lost, the first two experiences that we made at Story Studio. I'll talk a little bit about those. So, Story Studio was founded with a mission to expand the capability of positionally tracked virtual reality. Specifically, we wanted to prove that virtual reality could be a medium for telling all kinds of stories, and stories that had deep emotional impact. And to do that, we began by creating our first minimum viable product. This is Lost. And to do that, we said, all right, to be in a space that you can walk around in, you need to have a real-time engine, and we used Unreal in our case. So we began with Lost, and our goal was to try to hit awe and wonder. Really, it was just to try to prove that you can tell any kind of story, and we feel like we succeeded. With Henry, we said, all right, we did awe and wonder. We just first proved that you could tell a story. Let's try to go after family comedy. And so we went for this family-friendly cartoon approach, and we found that it had a much more powerful effect on people about how lonely he was. People felt the sadness more than the humor. And so we really doubled down on the feels. And we went for an experience that people felt emotion in, and that was really successful. We're now working on a movie called Dear Angelica. And with Dear Angelica, we're trying to go for a new artistic style. We're also trying to explore a story that can go through grief and acceptance. And we're starting to play a little bit more with interactivity. But before I go into the meat of the presentation, I want to talk about why do we tell stories to begin with. This is my personal opinion. I think that we as humans share stories because we cannot experience all the things in a lifetime that there is to experience. There are things that are impossible to experience because they just defy the physical world. But if we tell stories of how people go through their own trials, obstacles, emotions, go to places that no one has ever been before, I think it helps us develop as humans to be able to deal with our own obstacles and emotions. And so if you believe that theory, that that's why we tell stories, then VR has presence, capital P, presence. And I believe that putting someone into a place and telling them a story as if they are there is that much more powerful. And I have a favorite quote from Roger Ebert, who he said, movies are like a machine for empathy. And if you believe that, I think that adding presence makes that machine that much more powerful. But here's the problem right now. The holodeck is a very long way away. And I think everyone wants the holodeck now. They see virtual reality, and our imagination has been filled up with this idea that this is what we should be making for. And I feel that people are making less compelling experiences because they're reaching too far. And so that's the bulk of my talk. It's a little bit of cold water. It's recognizing VR is a very small medium right now. It's right at the beginning. Pragmatically, it has a lot of constraints. And I think to make something that's immersive and compelling, you have to embrace those constraints. And so I'm going to be talking about production constraints, technical constraints, and then finally, creative constraints. So when we started with production on both Lost and Henry, we took this approach of, let's just take a filmmaking pipeline. I have a lot of experience in computer animation. And let's just shove interactivity somewhere in there. And come up with a story, works great, and then, hey, let's just add a little bit of interactivity on top, and it'll feel awesome. And we found that that was naively inaccurate. For example, on Henry, we went into the experience, we had a great story, we loved Henry, and we said, you know what, we're feeling like we need to have some moment that feels like it's acknowledging your presence. And so we started playing with the idea of him looking at you. And we're like, wow, this is really cool that he's tracking my eyes. But then it started breaking the story, because if he's looking at your eyes, then he's not alone, you're there with him. So we should have thought of that from the very beginning with story. With Lost, we built a story that we liked. It was a really cool real-time experience. And then we wanted to add some interactivity. So we said, what if we waited until the user was looking in a certain direction to key each story beat? And what eventually began happening is it felt like a shooting gallery. There were people who were saying, all right, I feel like the pacing is really slow. I must not be looking in the right place. And so it felt like they're like, OK, I'm doing it wrong. I'm just searching the environment, waiting for that trigger to happen. And so that felt broken. So this is the kind of pipeline that I was used to in my time at Pixar, where you had story development that you figured out through storyboards and animatics. You had a previs period where you figured out the art and style. And we found that we need to rethink things. We're not really producing a single thing. We're also inventing. And so we are still figuring this out right now at our studio. But we realize there's now this thing we're calling proto-viz, where you have to have prototyping and previs working together as you prototype cool interactive experiences and have that inform your story. And so there's a lot of feedback loop that's happening there. And so there's a lot that we're still trying to figure out. Also, because we're inventing and producing at the same time, we really have no idea what we're making. When I was making films at Pixar, you could see a storyboard and an animatic, and you kind of knew. You're like, I've seen enough movies. I've seen Pixar films go to finish. I know that this will turn into something great when it's working at this stage. But because we're so new to virtual reality, it's hard to know, will this work when we finally put polish on it? And so we found that using an agile approach, and this is new to those of us coming from film. Agile is something used in games for a long time. But the ability to set your goals in smaller increments, use sprints, use milestones, is something that you need. The other thing that we had to start changing our thinking on is when you're making a film, the building block of your experience is a shot. Right? You can think about, all right, I'm going to bid out this movie. It's going to have on the order of 1,500 shots. There's going to be an animator on each shot, an effects artist, lighting artist. You could bid it out that way. But in virtual reality, a lot of times you're sitting there in a scene, and the action is happening around you. There's no cuts, but there's a lot of work to be done. You can't, an animator who's animating 10 minutes of an experience will take forever. So you need some way of breaking that up across your team. So on Henry, we came up with this idea of story beats, where we would give it to separate animators. But we had another problem where in movies, the cut has this great effect of change blindness. You can have one animator work on one shot, and then another animator work on the shot next to it, and you don't have to worry about continuity. The last pose of that animator's shot does not have to match the next pose, because the camera is such a dramatic change that you just believed it. But for us, we had to, as animators were working, they had to compare their start poses and end poses to make sure they all lined up. There's also this problem that in order to make, say, 3 seconds of great animation, a shot length for a movie is about that long, you have to have a lot of people working on it at the same time. Your animator has to be working, your lighting artist, effects artist, your interactive artist. And right now we're finding that real-time tools don't allow you to work concurrently a lot. But we know that Unreal is making something called Sequencer that's helping this type of workflow. So I think real-time game engines are recognizing this and building workflows to allow people to work at the same time on the same timeline. Also, the audience has no length expectations right now. So movies have built in this time of about 90 to 140 minutes, theater around the same, about the length it takes before you have to go to the bathroom, right? That's understood in movie and theater. Games have about a 20 to 40-hour expectation if you're going to spend a certain amount of money. VR doesn't have any expectation right now. If anything, everything is more on the short side because everyone's just giving demos. You can't make an hour-long experience if you're going to demo to 20 people or hundreds of people over the course of a day. And so we're kind of at where film was back in Nickelodeon, where people were willing to pay a nickel just to see something cool. And I think we should embrace that. And so I think VR resets audience expectations. I think everyone's trying to go for, what's the long form of this thing? Let's use this time to figure out this medium and make our experiences shorter and more polished. All right, now this is a little embarrassing. This is a video capture on my iPhone of what one of our dailies looks like. So I'm used to dailies being everyone's sitting in a room, all looking at a big screen, saying, all right, here's the shot for the day, and everyone can give their feedback. Everyone's looking at the same thing. This is our production designer, Kendall Cronkite, in VR, pointing out things she wants to fix as other people are looking at a monitor. This means that our iteration loop is not as good. So I want to fix this. I do want to have a workflow where you can all be in VR together and have dailies where you're annotating stuff in space, you have virtual laser pointers. But for now, this iteration loop is nowhere near as good as what we have in movies and games. Right now, most of the tools are built to make screened experiences. So Unreal as a game editor is an amazing interface for making a screened game. For Dear Angelica, we started to create an experience where we took illustrations and then projected them against 3D geometry. And it wasn't working. We were like, in order to capture an artist's idea of how things should work in 3D, we need a way for them to work in 3D. And so that's where we invented Quill. So we just announced Quill at Sundance this past year. This is a tool made by Inigo Quilez to give our art director a tool where she creates the assets in virtual reality, and we use those directly in our experience. And I think these are the type of things that are going to change the way production is done. But for now, we have to realize that all the tools we're using are inferior to what they will become. All right, so that's production constraints. Now I want to talk a little bit about the technical constraints. And we love to use this metaphor that we're trying to fit a big cat into a small box. We are trying to hit an 11 millisecond deadline with rendering more pixels to 2 eyes. And so every millisecond is precious. On Henry, we made some hard decisions up front. We said, all right, there's going to be no dynamic shadows. We are going to bake in all of the shadowing effects. We're going to put our vertices where they count, mostly in Henry. But we did recognize that because you're standing there in a space that we can kind of control, right? You're only able to move around in about maybe a 10-foot by 10-foot area. We can use a lot more smoke and mirrors because you don't have a controller to walk around an entire space. This is an example of one of the tricks that we used. So instead of using dynamic shadows, what if we just represent Henry by a bunch of spheres? If you want to look into this code, there's a shader toy that you can check out. So this is more his ambient occlusion, his context shadows on the surface. You can also do it for sort of a soft, direct lit shadow. And just using that and representing Henry's butt by a sphere and his top torso, it's believable. So as for the other shadows in Henry, we used a lot of projected textures. So a lot of these are set dressed in the scene in a static position, so you can just take those textures, project them down. We did have a lot of props that got displaced, so Henry would kick over a bench. And so what we did was we blended off his rest position shadow, let the animation happen for the bench, and then when it came to rest, then blended on the final rest position shadow. For some of the props, we switched over to the sphere representation while it was moving, but most of the time, people didn't notice that it just didn't have a shadow while it was moving. You need to budget vertices and textures. Fitting in 11 milliseconds is a hard deadline. And so we knew Henry he is actually most of our budget. And so to get that fur look, you can see, go back. We had over 18,000 texture cards just to represent his fur. That's around 70,000 vertices. To get the blending approach, we used a cool alpha to coverage trick in order to get this feeling that there was transparency in the texture. One thing I did notice coming from computer animation is that we didn't have the level of detail that we were used to. We're used to subdivision surfaces, where the closer you get to the object, the more it tessellates. And tessellation shaders are now in the real-time world, and so I think we need to leverage this stuff even more. So right now we are looking into how to create cage meshes like this that are low res, but then give you more detail as you get closer. So LOD is a big problem in both computer animation and real time, and I think tessellation shading is the way to go. Finally, and really this is the thing that got us there, is using design to limit complexity. So one of the reasons we chose a robot hand in Lost is because it's pretty simple. It's a simple rig. It's easier to animate. We also chose a nighttime environment because we didn't have to add as much modeling and texturing detail because you can't make it out. So those were design decisions to work within technical constraint. Same goes for Henry. Henry was a little bit more complex, but we designed Henry so he was kind of this cute, pill-looking characters on these stubby legs. And so we were working with the limitations of not having a lot of corrective shapes, not having a lot of bones. And Bernard, our character lead, did an amazing job in getting this real appeal. And Ramiro, the director, wanted to do this. He wanted something that was simple and easy, and it was great for us technically because we were able to fit in the box. All right, so that's a good segue into creative constraint. So a lot of technical constraint needs to be managed by making smart design decisions. One thing I learned at Pixar is if you can't make appealing humans, make a movie about toys. But beside the design decisions to help technical, there are creative constraints that we need to consider. All right, so presence, capital P presence, is what everyone says makes VR different. My interpretation of what presence is that there's less of an abstraction barrier between you as the input giver and then the feedback you get. So I've grown up on games, and I learned how to use a controller to give look and walk controls. But your mind is going through a pretty significant abstraction barrier to map this means walk. In virtual reality, that layer is much thinner. To look around, you look around. To walk and look at something, you do that in real life. Same goes with the hands. And so my theory is that because your brain isn't having to process this larger abstraction chain, your brain can process a VR experience much different. It's like there's more of your brain available to just soak it in because everything else is lizard brain. But this presents another problem. So this is the early animatic we had on Henry. We thought it was really cute. And you can see here that we are using these cuts, this idea that he's sort of jumping around in space to represent temporal time, so you don't have to see him actually traveling the distance to get to these moments. And in film, that you understand that. You understand if I go from here to there, yeah, sure, you don't need to show me the filler. When we started doing this in VR, it felt like he was a ghost teleporting around the room. And so we realized that what you forgive in film, what we have developed as audience members in film, we aren't ready for virtual reality. And so we're less forgiving in some respects. A good example of that is because you're now in the space, you're like, all right, I feel like I'm here, and there's a character right there. Why isn't he acknowledging me? Or if I get close to him, why isn't he doing something with me? And so we realized that you have to go into a story thinking about the rules of the world, thinking about your place in that world. You have to answer the question, am I a ghost? Am I the character's companion? Am I a third party? Am I in the crowd? If you're interested to read more about this, Matt Burdett, a member of our team, wrote something called the Swayze Effect, which talks about, like, I'm here, but I'm not getting feedback that I'm here. This is another thing that I'm seeing a lot, is because you're in virtual reality and because it's a real-time environment, everyone wants lots of choice. Because I can do anything with my hands and head, I want the environment to respond to all those things. But, as we know from one of my favorite games, Deus Ex, choice is the enemy of performance, right? So to create the level of choice you had in Deus Ex, you had pretty crappy performance. Because there's just so many choice and so much content you had to generate, you couldn't focus on making the animation really great. And so right now, it's my belief, make choice less, make performance really appealing. Because people are much less forgiving of performance in virtual reality. So I think VR makers aren't ready for long form. You might have seen this clip many times. This was the train coming into the station, one of the first films shown. when film was a budding new art form. We are at that time where we don't know what this medium is. We are blown away by the novelty of it. We get in VR and are just, oh my God, there's a bush right here, there's a tree, I can't believe this. And at the same time, we're trying to create narrative and interactivity and all of these things. I think to go for long form requires a complexity we aren't ready for. And really, the more important thing is that the audience isn't ready for long form. Most people in the world have not experienced virtual reality. The Rift is going to launch in about 2 weeks. And that'll be the first time people are going to really have virtual reality in their home. I think we need to recognize that they are in this novelty phase, and we need to reward that. We tried to create experiences on Henry and Lost where we added more detail, and people that we were showing to for the first time were getting lost. They weren't able to follow the story because they were like, holy crap, there's a thing right here, and they spent all their time just looking around it while there was a story happening over here. And this is near and dear to my heart. The Uncanny Valley is that much more pronounced in virtual reality. This is something that I learned in my computer animation days, that to make appeal, you need to stay away from looking too human. And because your mind is completely tricked to think you're there, if something is a little creepy, you are that much more creeped out, because there's no longer this abstraction barrier of a screen. So that's it. That's a bit of cold water. Those are the constraints. And really, the hard truth about VR right now is that it is underdeveloped as a medium for telling stories. Making movies, making games, making theater, those are mature art forms for telling stories. And we are just at the beginning to figure out how VR is its own medium for telling a story. These are the top of their game. This is movies, this is games. And I've talked to a lot of people who said, why are you making Henry as a virtual reality experience? I think it would be that much more compelling as a screened experience. And in some cases, they're right. We know, as storytellers, a lot more tricks in movies because we've grown up as movie watchers. And theater is also something that has developed over hundreds and hundreds of years. So right now, these early experiences in VR, I'm okay if they feel a little bit derivative, maybe a little awkward. We are stealing from mediums that we know, probably incorrectly. And it's only going to be through little innovations where we mutate an idea and try something new that we're going to find what makes VR unique. Now, I'm very proud of Henry and Lost, but I consider them baby steps. We are building a medium right now. And it's my hope that 5 years from now, I'll look back at them and laugh. Because 5 years from now, there's going to be a lot of baby steps we will have made and a lot of progress. That's it. Questions?
Hi there.
Yeah. Oh,
Greg,
yeah.
Greg from Solus. That was great. Could you tell us a wee bit more about your experiences and knowledge of storyboarding for 360 environments?
Yeah, so you saw that initial animatic. We did that for Lost and Henry. And we found that it gives you this false comfort in that, like, oh, this works great. This feels good to me because you're mapping your movie-going ability to it. And so what we started doing is we started doing two things. One thing we're calling a radio play, where we make an audio track of the experience and then have concept art kind of flash up. And so it's distant enough from the final product that you get a sense of the story without committing to things that look good on the screen. And the other thing we're starting to do, and we have hopes for Quill, is create a timeline in Quill. So you can actually create storyboard animatics around you, advance the frame, do it, so you get a sense of, oh, this feels good that this character is close. This world feels good. I like the scale. So you're doing concept work as well as getting a feel that it feels good the character starts here and then walks over here. You can't get that on a screen. And so right now, those are tools we're developing, if that answers your question.
That's great. Thanks.
Hi, I'm curious what your thoughts are on, you mentioned you don't really break the third wall in VR. So how does storytelling change if you're going from being a voyeur, sort of Rear Window by Hitchcock, to being a participant in the world? Does that change how you tell a story?
It's a great question. I don't know. Adding agency into virtual reality is so hard. I'm of the opinion right now that in the spirit of baby steps, I believe a story is told about a protagonist that isn't you. Right? I don't tell you a story of here's your emotional journey. And so I think that right now I like the idea that you are a tertiary character, or you have a reason to be there, but it's not your emotional arc. I think the stuff that is going to work to begin with are amnesia-like tales, where it's like you're the protagonist, but you have no background, and you jump in because as a gamer, you have no context of the world. So you have to build a character so the role-playing makes sense to where you are emotionally. The hard part there is if you go through emotions like love and sorrow and grief, how do you make someone grieve for a character they just met? I mean, if you're inhabiting a character, you're kind of, in some ways, an empty vessel because everyone brings their own emotions into it, and it's hard to predict as a director, this is how you should be feeling right now. That's a great question. That's one of the baby steps far down the road. Yeah.
Hi. Could you give some examples of some of the things you're doing in the prototype phase of your pipeline before pre-visualization?
Yeah. So we're having an interesting debate in the studio right now where we want a little bit of story, a little bit. Here's the world, here's the style, here's the bones of where I'm trying to go. And then when you begin with that, we think that's enough context that you can then say, all right, I think I'm inspired to come up with, all right, we have a character who wants to hand you something. Let's see what that mechanic looks like outside of a story moment or a story beat. Or we have a moment where the character looks at my eyes and emotes in some way. Is that compelling? We have a point where you make a decision or you can get in the character's way and the character notices that. So we're trying to create these little minimum viable product prototypes that will then, the storyteller's like, ooh, that was really cool. I have a story idea now that could make that work even better. And so right now the Story Studio is a mix of people who come from computer animation and film and games. And right now the games guys are like, dude, we need to prototype a lot more. We're too stuck in the story way of thinking. And that's the way we're going.
Cool. Thanks.
Over here.
Yeah.
In your work, are you concerned at all about the long term of VR in the sense of the attenuation effect, the idea that a given stimulus in the same nerve line will not generate the same response over time? It strikes me that if we're using VR as a kind of empathy engine, then maybe we as a society have a limited amount of time to really employ that to the greatest effect before we develop kind of the same inhibitory barriers that give us the ability now to thumb through a magazine with pictures of starving children, and you don't quite notice them the way you used to, nor do we as a society.
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually think right now one of the reasons virtual reality is an exciting new field for a lot of people is because we do have an atrophy in the other mediums we're used to.
Exactly.
When movies first came out, if someone got punched on screen, everyone had a really emotional reaction to that. They felt like they were in a room where someone got punched. Now you can see someone's head get cut off, and we're used to it. Virtual reality has reset that, and so now I think if you're just in a room where people are arguing in virtual reality, it's intense. I think that is the march of technology when it comes to storytelling. I think that VR will eventually have a fatigue to it. I think it will take a long time because I think that VR as a medium just has so much breadth that we will be finding out as many new things as movies did over the course of 100 years.
Do you think that we as developers then have any sort of responsibility to try to lengthen that life, to use it responsibly, to maybe step up?
Yeah, I think of it more as a subconscious thing. I think if we do prove that this medium has breadth, that will happen naturally. That in movies right now, people come out with something new and novel because they're looking at the rules of how to be a director and tell a story, and they're breaking them, and they're changing them. Right? A great student of film knows the rules so that he can break them. Right now, we have no idea what the rules are. So I think over time, VR will develop rules, and we will have expectations, and then we will twist them and break them. And I think because virtual reality has such a strong presence mechanic that I think it's going to be much easier to break because the mind is so tricked already that you can play with that assumption.
Gotcha. Thank you. It gives me confidence to know that people like you are part of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great talk. I want to ask, like, is there a good method to get players' attention? Because, like, people that look everywhere and they're not paying attention to the story.
Yeah, it's a great question. Sound works really well. It's the first thing you go to, and it works. Because you know where the head is and you have spatialized audio, people tend to go to it. We did worry that because we're giving so much choice for people to look around and feel in the space, that they would look in the wrong direction. And we found that actually if you give people that time, this is what Sashka, our creative director, calls the letting go period, you kind of get it out of your system, and then if something interesting is happening, people will tend to look at it. So sure, someone could watch Henry and just be looking over in a corner the whole time. We've never seen that happen. Everyone wants to be along for the ride. And so if the story is being told, and if you want to ignore it, that's your right. You could take the headset off. But I don't think we need to be worried about being ham-fisted with like, no, you need to look here now, and if you don't, you're breaking it. I think people will naturally do it if it's designed in a compelling way. Yeah.
Great talk. Really nice getting the perspective you're bringing. It's interesting because the first time I saw the famous train sequence was at a talk here at GDC back in, I think, 1989, when people were just saying, what is this going to mean for the games industry in the same way? And what strikes me with some of what you're saying is that particularly this idea that people get so distracted by being in VR that they don't notice the story. That may be, oh my God, that's a train, and they're not noticing the story you're trying to tell about people getting on and off the train. And once people have all had that chance to experience virtual reality a few times, do you think that they'll still need to, a settling in period for a few minutes, or will they just immediately want to see the story?
That's a great question. So I've been in virtual reality professionally for about 2 years now. I am now ready for the pacing of things to get better. I look back on Henry and I feel like it's slow. So I think I'm already getting to a point where I'm like, no, I'm ready for cuts. I'm ready for teleports. I think I can do it. It's hard right now because I know the audience we're seeing are at the beginning of that process. And so I do think that either we will start making decisions that start pushing the audience towards that direction, or we will wait until they've sort of warmed up to that idea. But I think you're right, that as we get better as audience members, it will change. It goes back to if you showed a movie now to someone who was watching movies in the 1920s, it would look like art. It would just be like, this is happening too fast. It's just abstract images being fed to my eyes. I think VR is going to go through that same arc. All right, that's it.
Max?
Yeah. Oh, I think that was the last question. Sorry, we got to go. But come on up afterwards. I'd be happy to answer any questions.